Jerry Stiller finally reveals what most fans never figured out about Seinfeld. Right now, in 2025, a show that premiered in 1989 is sitting in the top 0.2% of all television demand worldwide. In March 2025, Seinfeld registered a staggering 34.9 times the audience demand of the average show in the United States. Parrot Analytics' entire generations who weren't even born when it aired are binge-watching it on Netflix tonight, and most of them have absolutely no idea that the version of the show they're watching almost didn't exist. Because in 1993, NBC had a massive, embarrassing problem that nobody wanted to put in a memo. Seinfeld was technically a hit, but the energy was stalling because George Costanza's father was, quite frankly, too nice. Then Jerry Stiller walked into an audition and staged a silent rebellion that changed television history forever. He ignored the director's notes, unleashed a frantic and screaming energy, and saved the show from the polite parent trap. But wait, it gets weirder. The erasure of John Randolph. To understand how Seinfeld actually became the show millions are obsessing over on Netflix today, you have to look at the footage that was essentially sent to a digital incinerator. Back in Season 4, in a May 1993 episode titled The Handicap Spot, audiences met Frank Costanza for the first time. But the man on screen wasn't the red-faced, screaming ball of neurotic energy we all know. Instead, viewers saw John Randolph, a Tony Award-winning actor and a 50-year veteran of stage and screen. He was respected, he was talented, and he played Frank Costanza as a calm, sensible, and relatively patient man. He looked like the kind of father who would give you solid advice about your 401k. But Larry David, the co-creator and architect of the show's dark DNA, watched the dailies and realized they had a structural catastrophe. If George's father were a sane, rational person, then George's entire personality wouldn't make sense. Frank was originally written as passive, taking a backseat to George's mother Estelle, who had a more dominant, loud, and aggressive presence. Screen rant: if your dad is a reasonable guy, your constant lying and extreme social anxiety just make you look like a jerk making bad choices. But if your dad is a ticking time bomb of irrational rage, your neurosis isn't a choice anymore. It's a survival mechanism. It's trauma. Larry David became so obsessed with this realization that he didn't just recast the role for future episodes. He decided to scrub John Randolph from the show's history entirely. Once Stiller had been permanently cast, Larry David was troubled by syndicated reruns of The Handicap Spot still featuring Randolph's footage. In a DVD featurette, David explained how the inconsistency between actors prompted him to reshoot Frank's scenes with Stiller to further illustrate his permanence in the role. /film they brought the entire cast back to the original sets and refilmed every single one of Randolph's scenes. When the show went into reruns, the original Frank Costanza would effectively cease to exist. Think about that for a second. You're a veteran actor with a lifetime of accolades, and you're being systematically deleted from the most popular sitcom in the world because you were too sensible. It sounds like an Orwell novel, but in high-stakes television, it was a mechanical necessity. Larry David needed the Costanza household to feel like a pressure cooker. The original vibe with Randolph felt too much like a standard 1980s sitcom, and Seinfeld was trying to kill that entire genre. They needed someone who could make a conversation about a silver dollar feel like the opening shot of a domestic war. But wait, it gets weirder. The audition rebellion. When Jerry Stiller walked onto the Seinfeld set in 1993, he wasn't looking to create a television legend. He was looking for a way out. Upon finding out he would be replacing John Randolph, the comedian initially had mixed feelings about taking the role. Screen Rant: the directions he received from the writers were, in his own words, deaf. According to an archival interview with the Television Academy's Foundation, Stiller was explicitly told to play Frank as a passive, subservient man who cowered whenever his wife raised her voice. The Frank Costanza we know, the man who once screamed "Serenity now" until his veins nearly popped, was originally supposed to be a quiet, henpecked husband who spent his scenes shrugging. Stiller spent the first few days of rehearsals trying to make this work. He put on the cap, he lowered his head, and he spoke his lines with the defeated tone of a man who had completely surrendered to life. But the character was a black hole of energy. He felt like he was playing a prop rather than a person, and the comedy evaporated every time he opened his mouth. Here is where it gets interesting. Stiller was initially asked to wear a bald cap and contrast Estelle as a meeker persona, but the actor decided on his fourth day to start screaming back at George's mother in their scene. Screen Rant: he was convinced he was going to be fired anyway. He was in his late 60s, he had nothing to lose, and he was bored out of his mind. So during a dress rehearsal where Estelle Harris was supposed to berate him for a minor domestic failure, Stiller reached his breaking point. Instead of cowering, he suddenly straightened his back, looked her dead in the eye, and shrieked his response at the top of his lungs. He didn't say the lines, he launched them like physical projectiles. The entire cast and crew froze. According to accounts from Vulture, Estelle Harris was so caught off guard she actually jumped, but she didn't stop. She yelled back. Suddenly, what had been a one-sided lecture became a frantic, high-decibel tennis match of pure, unadulterated frustration. It was the birth of explosive Frank. Larry. David was sitting in the back of the darkened studio. The reaction was immediate. He didn't just like it, he realized his original passive idea had been entirely wrong. The comedy didn't come from George having one loud parent and one quiet parent. It came from George being the product of two people constantly at war with the world and each other. It's an uncomfortable truth for many writers to hear, but some of the greatest moments in television history weren't meticulously planned in a writer's room. They were acts of pure desperation by actors who were too tired or too bored to follow the rules anymore. Stiller's decision to scream was a rebellion against a flat script, and in doing so, he accidentally rewrote the DNA of the entire show. He transformed Frank from a background character into a force of nature. And the screaming didn't just change Frank, it forced everyone else to level up. Jason Alexander realized he had to react to this new volcanic energy. If Frank was this volatile, then George's frantic lying and constant panic suddenly had a clear, hilarious origin story. Everything about the Costanza family dynamic clicked into place during one afternoon in 1993. The psychology of serenity. If you really want to understand the madness of Frank Costanza, you have to look at the phrase that defined a decade of televised frustration: serenity now. On the surface, it was just another ridiculous catchphrase. But when Stiller shouted those two words at the ceiling while his face turned a shade of purple that probably worried the on-set medics, he was actually dismantling the entire self-help culture of the 1990s in a single breath. The 90s were obsessed with the New Age movement, with everyone from corporate executives to suburban parents trying to find inner peace through mantras and mindfulness. But in the hands of Frank Costanza, serenity wasn't a state of mind, it was a demand. He didn't achieve peace, he tried to bully the universe into giving it to him. According to an archival tribute in Rolling Stone, Stiller's brilliance was in weaponizing a Zen concept. He transformed a peaceful suggestion into a frantic, high-decibel scream that perfectly captured the absurdity of suppressing a lifetime of rage with a catchy slogan. Now, here's where it gets interesting and honestly a bit controversial. If you watch the old episodes closely, Frank Costanza has a very specific, disjointed way of speaking. He'll be in the middle of a sentence and then suddenly stop. He'll look up at the ceiling, squint like he's trying to remember a name from 40 years ago, then finish the thought with a completely different energy. This became known as the acting pause. For years, people wondered if it was a sophisticated creative choice. The truth is a mix of both. According to reports from The Hollywood Reporter, Stiller was often genuinely struggling to remember the fast-paced dialogue that writers were constantly tweaking. But instead of breaking character, he leaned into the silence. He turned his own confusion into Frank's confusion, made it look like Frank was literally searching the corridors of his own fractured mind. Jason Alexander has spoken about how frustrating those pauses could be in the moment. Sitcom acting is usually a fast, rhythmic back and forth, like jazz. When Stiller would stop for 5 full seconds, the rhythm would die. But when the producers watched the tapes, those pauses were the funniest parts of the episode. They made Frank feel unpredictable. They made him feel like a real person struggling under the weight of his own thoughts. While Frank Costanza's mental health struggles were hilarious to audiences, they represented something very real. Frank was part of that post-war generation told to keep everything inside, to work hard, and to never show weakness. When you take that kind of repression and add the stresses of 1990s suburban life, serenity now isn't just a joke. It's a cry for help from a man who has no other tools. The truth about Festivus. Most of us celebrate December 23rd by posting memes about aluminum poles or jokingly airing grievances at our friends. But the thing about Festivus is this: what we see as a quirky piece of television writing was actually a deeply strange reality for a family in Chappaqua, New York. According to an investigative piece by Smithsonian Magazine, the holiday for the rest of us wasn't dreamed up in a sunny writer's room. It was the invention of Dan O'Keefe, a senior editor at Reader's Digest and the father of Seinfeld writer Dan O'Keefe. In real life, the elder O'Keefe started Festivus in the 1960s as a way to celebrate the anniversary of his first date with his wife. But as years passed, it morphed into something far more intense. There was no aluminum pole in the original version. Instead, the O'Keefe family would gather around a clock nailed inside a paper bag. To this day, the younger Dan O'Keefe says he doesn't know what the clock in the bag signified because his father would never tell him. When O'Keefe became a writer for Seinfeld, he didn't even want to mention the holiday, he was embarrassed by it. But his fellow writers found out, and Larry David, being the connoisseur of social awkwardness that he is, insisted it go into the show. This is where Stiller's genius changed everything. He took this bizarre family trauma and played it with such deadly serious conviction that it transformed from a private nightmare into a global phenomenon. He didn't play Frank as a man doing a funny bit. He played him as a man who truly believed the commercialism of Christmas had destroyed the American soul. When he stood in that kitchen and announced the airing of grievances, he wasn't winking at the camera. He was a man who had finally found a way to discharge decades of built-up resentment. For the real O'Keefe family, Festivus was a source of genuine fear and confusion. Dan O'Keefe has described the real holiday as a proletarian nightmare. It wasn't a fun, kitschy alternative to Christmas, it was a manifestation of his father's eccentricities and a constant reminder that their home didn't follow the rules of the rest of the world. Stiller took that tragedy, that sense of being trapped in an irrational parent's world, and made audiences feel like they were part of the family. The syndication goldmine. By the time Seinfeld wrapped its legendary run, Stiller wasn't just a guest star who got lucky with a few funny lines. He had become a financial juggernaut. And the numbers bear that out in a way that would have been unimaginable when he first walked onto that set at 65 years old. The show earned Jerry Seinfeld $267 million in 1998 alone and raked in billions after that through record-breaking syndication deals, eventually becoming a streaming juggernaut when Netflix paid over $500 million for global rights. Stiller was collecting syndication checks from two of the biggest sitcoms of all time simultaneously, Seinfeld and The King of Queens, where he played Arthur Spooner for 9 more seasons after Seinfeld ended. Think about that for a second. Most actors are lucky to have one iconic role in a lifetime. Jerry Stiller found 2 back-to-back, both after the age of 65. And the show's cultural force hasn't dimmed. In July 2025, Seinfeld shot up to number 2 on iTunes' top 10 TV shows in the United States. CBR entire new generations are discovering Frank Costanza for the first time, and they're discovering him the way Stiller intended, as a man not performing comedy but genuinely, furiously, desperately trying to survive his own life. In his final interviews, Stiller admitted he never really felt like he was acting when he played Frank. He said he was just finally letting out all the built-up frustration of a man who had been in the industry for 50 years without a massive solo hit. He wasn't reaching for a character, he was tapping into 50 years of being told no, 50 years of bad auditions, 50 years of waiting for his moment. And here's what really stays with you. For 60 years, Jerry Stiller was one half of a legendary comedy duo with his wife, and Mira. When and passed away in 2015, the world expected Jerry to go quiet. But instead, he spent his final years describing her as the real architect of his success. He admitted that the internal confidence he needed to scream at those Seinfeld cameras came from the decades he spent being loved by a woman who thought he was enough. The loudest, angriest man on television was actually the most devoted, gentle partner off-screen. He wasn't just a comedian. He was a man who spent a lifetime practicing the art of partnership before he ever had to practice the art of Festivus. It's wild to think that the version of Seinfeld now streaming in 190 countries was almost entirely different, and it all came down to one man deciding to be difficult on a Tuesday afternoon. Jerry Stiller didn't just play a character. He forced the show to rewrite its own history, literally erasing a respected actor from the record to make room for his iconic rage. And 30 plus years later, that rage is still the most watchable thing on your screen. What do you think about his story?